Come all you jolly Shanty boys that put the shanty and go.
In a few years, these impenetrable forests will have fallen. The sons of civilization and industry will break the silence of the Saginaw. We are perhaps the last travelers to see the primitive forest grandeur.
It was the French statesman and author Alexis de Tocqueville who, while touring Michigan, recognized the importance of the timber found here. He predicted the trees would bring civilization to the Saginaw Valley. De Tocqueville was right. Soon investors and laborers were flocking to Michigan to make money from timber. What he couldn't predict, though, was the impact that the lumber industry would have on Michigan and the Saginaw Valley. Michigan's largest resource was in huge demand, and that in turn attracted settlers to the Saginaw Valley.
Initially, the pioneer settlers who came into the valley saw the trees as obstacles. They were primarily interested in the fur trade, fishing, and farming. And only as time passed and they gravitated into the farming did they realize that they could make some profits on the side by cutting the pine trees and selling them to nearby settlers. And as we moved out of the Saginaw Valley where the soil was poor, we discovered that the pine trees brought more wealth from the land than farming did. So initially, trees were not seen as such as a valuable resource, but gradually became more and more valuable by the time of the early 1840s, 1850s, prior to the Civil War. When the East Coast lumbermen ran out of wood in New York, they sent prospectors into Michigan to look for more. These men were called timber cruisers. They surveyed the state and reported back to the investors there was white pine for as far as the eye could see. There would be enough to keep the sawmills in operation for years to come. Pine was the basic building block in America prior to the Civil War. At that time, of course, it was used for building houses, log cabin construction. It was soft, it was pliable, it was not free, and it was very, very light. In Michigan, we had some tremendous stands of pine. There is a stand of pine reputedly in Gladwin County running along the Tittabawassee River for about 80 miles where the trees stood 175 feet tall, and you could get a board 40 feet long, 12 inches wide with absolutely no knots in it at all. So this certainly impressed the lumberjacks who had come from the East Coast, and very quickly they began to send their timber cruisers out here to find land in which they would, of course, cut the valuable pine. Purchasing agents came to the region to buy tracts of land from the federal government. They paid as little as $1.25 an acre and bought plots 40 acres at a time. Henry Sage was one of the first businessmen to start buying up the land here. By 1865, Sage and his partner, John McGraw, moved their sawmill operation from New York to Bay City.
Prior to 1864, most of the sawmills were owned by small local businessmen, and they employed probably less than 100 people. When Sage and McGraw came on the scene, everything exploded, and they very quickly employed more than 300 people in the mill. Then they built the town, the infrastructure, and everything to go along with it.
Other businessmen soon followed. They bought their own property and built their own sawmills. Michigan's timber was in demand all over the country and the world. Essentially, you can look at two distribution areas, the Lake Michigan area and the Lake Huron area for Michigan pine. A good year to remember is 1871 when the Chicago fire occurred, and most of the lumber along the Muskegon River, the west side of the state, heads towards Chicago, and actually it's Michigan pine that rebuilt Chicago after the Great Fire in 1871. After that, much of it is shipped by rail out west, where it ends up being not necessarily for house building because they're building sod houses, but for railroad ties. They're using it for fence posts and then sort of tertiarily for home building. On the eastern side, of course, out of the Saginaw Valley region, Saginaw and Bay City ship their lumber southward. Much of it goes to Detroit, Toledo, which connected with Cincinnati by the Ohio Canal, and the bulk of it goes to Tonawanda and Buffalo because that's the mouth of the Erie Canal, where it's then taken by the Erie Canal to Albany, which is a large lumber trading center, and from Albany it goes down the Hudson River, of course, to New York. So the east side of the state goes east along the canal system and the Great Lakes, and the west side goes principally directly to Chicago.
Men who loaded these boats were called dock wallopers. The term came from the sound made when planks and logs and square timbers were dropped onto a boat, thus creating a wallop sound. These men received from 40 to 45 cents per hour for loading these boats. In 1883, there was shipped out of Bay City over 552 million feet of lumber. This does not take into account the square timber, lath, shingle, and other wood products.
Word quickly spread about the quality of Michigan's timber. Industries began demanding that only white pine lumber be used in their products. At its peak, the lumber industry was a $3 billion industry. In today's dollars, that business would be worth $57 trillion.
Probably the most obvious impact of logging and lumbering along the Saginaw River is the growth of the cities. West Bay City and Bay City and East Saginaw and Saginaw City had a population of approximately 1,500 and 3,000 in the 1860 census. By 1884, both cities were close to 40,000 people. Initially, we had sort of traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant settlers coming into the Saginaw Valley, but with the advent of logging and lumbering, we began to have a lot of immigrants coming in, especially after the 1870s, and you began to have a number of Southeast Europeans and people from the Scandinavian countries who were settling to work in the lumbering and logging business.
The Saginaw Valley waterways made it easy to transport logs from the woods. The Tittabawassee, Chippewa, Shiawassee, and Cass rivers all connect to the Saginaw River and then out to Lake Huron's Saginaw Bay. This port area made it easy for the timber to be shipped back east.
River traffic increased tremendously because of the demand for logs and lumber. And not only was it important, of course, as a source of hauling logs from the interior, but the river also became important because it was the distribution center for sending cut lumber to points along the Lake Huron and Lake Erie shoreline.
Shortly after the Civil War, the future of the Saginaw Valley looked promising. Many predicted lumbering would go on for many years. What they didn't know was that several factors would shorten the life of Michigan's white pine era.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.